Beowulf is probably one of those pieces that you've at least skimmed the cliff notes of before, because it's very common in a lot of high school and college curriculums. And it does have a reputation, which I believe is undeserved, that it's a very boring thing to read and a pain in the butt. In reality, in my opinion, Beowulf can actually be a very interesting leisure read, and it can be a good way to get a glimpse into the origins of modern day fantasy, as it greatly influenced J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm Sidewin from Sidewin's Archive, and today I am going to be talking about this epic poem and why you should read it. So to start here, what is Beowulf really? Like, everyone's heard of it at least once if you've grown up in an English-speaking region like the United States. However, a lot of us probably don't really have a good view of what the poem is. So it is epic poetry. The definition of an epic poem is basically a poem that is very long. Like, Beowulf is somewhere around 1,000 lines. However, that doesn't necessarily make it harder to read, because it can flow very well, and it was originally meant for oral recitation. So in fact, audiobooks are a very good tool to see how this would have originally been seen. Now, I'm going to go a little bit to what is the historical context of Beowulf. So it was written around the 8th century, so that's about the 700s, in Old English. That is the date given by J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote a lot about it. Some scholars will dispute this date. However, the Old English is important here because our modern day English is not actually that close to it. Old English is a separate language. In fact, most of our vocabulary in modern day English comes from Latin, indirectly through French, or adopted from various other languages, and only some of our linguistic principles are actually derived from Old English. I'll go more into detail on translations and the development of English later, because it's important to understand in order to understand why translation matters for Beowulf. Another key fact about Beowulf is that it's derived from an Anglo-Saxon or Germanic tradition, and it's speaking about a pre-Christian time, potentially. So, to explain, early on, the British Isles, even today, were mostly inhabited by peoples who are known as the Celtic peoples. The Romans, when they invaded England, found a Celtic people there, the Britons, and there were other Celtic peoples around. In fact, some of these Celtic peoples are still majorities in certain regions of the country, and their languages are still spoken today. An example would be Welsh. The closest language to Old English, however, is actually Frisian, spoken in an island off the Netherlands. However, Frisian is not Celtic, it's actually Germanic, and it's the closest language today to Old English. But you see, you might note there's a discontinuity there. Like, how can the language closest to Old English, from which our modern English derives, be not Celtic if the Celts lived there? Well, the answer is that a group of people known as the Anglo-Saxons invaded the British Isles. And it's actually their language, Old English, which became the basis for our modern English. Now, where did these people come from? That's actually something that Beowulf gives us a hint to, that we also can find in other sources. This map, derived from Wiglaf, who is actually taking his username from a character in Beowulf, from Wikimedia Commons. I made it black and white for just not giving you a color flash. However, you can see here all of the different peoples of the Germanic peoples of the era. There's a couple not listed here, but these are the ones which appear in Beowulf, or at least are related. So you can see on here those Frisians I mentioned. They're down south on this map. And you can also see other groups, like the Angles. You might note similarity to Anglo-Saxon. And then the Jutes, the Danes, the Geats, the Wolfings, and the Swedes. The most important of these in the poem itself are the Geats and the Danes. Beowulf is a Geat, and he eventually becomes the king of them. This is not a spoiler for the actual poem. Nothing I'm saying is. It's foreshadowed repeatedly. And then the Danes are the people he goes to help. Both follow a Germanic culture, And in fact, this culture bears some resemblance to the earlier Norse mythology. And that influence is seen in Beowulf when he's compared to Sigismund, a powerful Norse hero, which honestly, that's also predictive in another sense. But on here, you can see this is not the British Isles, whereas the poem was written in the British Isles. And these peoples were not originally Christian, they were later converted. So, as you can see, like there's a lot of influences here that came together. And Beowulf is kind of harkening back to this origin of the people of Britain. So now to continue, what is the literary and historical value of Beowulf? I've spoken about this already a bit, but I've got a couple of key points to mention here. So to start, it gives us an example of Old English literature. A lot of Old English literature has been destroyed over the about 1,000 years since it was written. And as most people today do not read it, and as most of the people in medieval times did not read it, and a lot of it was forgotten about for around 800 years, just a lot of it hasn't survived. In fact, Beowulf has only survived in one manuscript, which is basically a fluke of history type moment. So we're very lucky it got passed down to us. It could have very easily burnt in the fire like thousands of other documents. There were monastery burnings. You can find that a lot in English history. The second is that Beowulf allows us to see what was a hero in the Anglo-Saxon society. Because, well, it's a pre-Christian hero archetype too, because the Anglo-Saxons were not originally Christian, as most of the peoples around them were not, and their concept of a hero would of course be a bit different. But then, like to note, it gives us that glimpse, but then it's through a Christian lens. Like the author was obviously Christian, as he frequently makes references to God in his writing of the poem. He might have even gotten the poem from an oral tradition from before he wrote it down. However, most scholars agree that the poem itself is the work of a single author. It's not a cooperation type thing. Now, the final thing here is that it heavily influenced J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. I've mentioned Tolkien before now, but like one thing to understand here is part of the reason it influenced it so much is that Tolkien's main claim to academic fame is his work on Beowulf. He wrote a translation, which was only published in like 2014 by his son, about 30 years or more after his death. But then he also frequently gave lectures on it, which his students very much remembered. You can find lots of anecdotes about his fancy Beowulf lectures. And he also has a lot of different papers on it. So if you're looking for just like more interest because you like Tolkien, that could be a fun avenue to go down. But I'm not going down it any farther right now. Then I'm going to mention there is entertainment value to it. Like, I've mainly talked about the historical and the literary value, mostly the historical, because that's where I am. I'm more in the history type interest. However, the poem itself and the language in it is actually really interesting to read. Like, it has vibrant descriptions of the different combats, and it's very similar to Tolkien again. Like, if you've exhausted all of Tolkien's works and want another one, Beowulf can be a very good option. And it's also a quick read. Like, I read through it a couple of the translations in the past, and most of them only took me like 1 hour. Then again, I'm used to older linguistic forms. However, if you get popular translations, it is a very quick read. Like, you can sit down on a weekend afternoon, cuddle up with the book, and finish it within a couple of hours. It doesn't matter your reading speed, you will finish it. Which can also mean that it can be very good inspiration for other fantasy type things. I'll get more into that later. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about translation and English itself. So the chart you can see here on the left is actually like the development of the English language. So as you can see on that chart, there are two main trees on here, Latin and Germanic. We have a lot of other random vocabulary and a bunch of things pulled from various other languages. Like a lot of our vocabulary is derived from Greek, partially through Latin, but Germanic and Latin are the two main groups. Then, as you can see on this chart, they went down into what's called Old French, on the French side of it, and Old English. Now, why would French come into this? If you're unaware of it, in 1066, there was a succession struggle for England between three men. One was the local English guy named Harold. One was somewhere up in the Northlands. He did not win, so I don't really remember his name. And the last one was a Norman nobleman named William. William the Bastard at that point, because he was the illegitimate son of his father and only inherited the Duchy of Normandy because all the other boys died. Now, Norman is a word I haven't said before right now. So the Normans were basically a group of Vikings who were given the northern part of France, today called Normandy, as a way to pay them off from attacking the rest of France. And they took it over and became Christian. And Normandy remained a powerful part of France for quite a while. However, that king dying and then Harold taking the throne of England, that was disputed. William the Bastard claimed that he had as much of a right as Harold did. So William invaded England. And at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William won, and Harold was killed by an arrow in the head. This is depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. You can look it up online. And at that point, the language of the upper classes in England became French because they were Normans from Normandy. And it also led to a lot of other historical developments involving, well, the King of England having controlled part of France. But we're not going into that right now. So out of that Old French and Old English mix, a new language called Middle English evolved. And Middle English is actually much more similar to modern English. The later form of it, we can actually read aloud and sound out and understand a lot of the words if you're a native English speaker. The earlier part, not so much. But the later part includes people like Chaucer. And then modern English evolved somewhere in the early modern period. And there's what's called early modern English, the language of Shakespeare, if you've read any of his work. And then after that, it's gradually evolved to what we speak today. Now, you might be wondering, why exactly do I have this thing that looks like gibberish up on the right side? That's actually some of the original text of Beowulf. And as you can see, it doesn't share all the letters with our modern day English. In fact, you can probably see 2 or 3 letters that we don't use anymore. One of those being the thorn, which is the TH sound. That's the weird line with a little loop on it. And it disappeared somewhere between Middle English and Modern English. But, as you can see, you can't really read that. So then, if you want to read Beowulf and you can't read the original, what can you do? Well, the answer is you get a good translation. So here I have listed a few of the ones I've actually read, but I'm going to focus on why are translations debated here. So to start, the first one that comes up is, what is the focus of the translation? Like, is it trying to create a pretty poem, or is it trying to directly translate the meaning? So like an example is when you're reading about J.R.R. Tolkien's translation, he focused on meaning because he was an academic and focused on that. Whereas Seamus Heaney his was actually the easiest one to read. However, a lot of people criticize its accuracy because it's not precisely translating the meaning of all the words. He's just trying to make it a nice sounding poem. So like he rhymes a lot of the lines when in the original it's not rhyming. And in doing so, he eliminates some of the specific descriptions. The translation closer to the original text that I've read was by Burton Raphael and written in the 1950s. And it's a little trickier to read, but honestly, it balances it reasonably well. I have not read any academic translations, but I have skimmed some of the Project Gutenberg file. It's free online if you want to access it. So, now that I've talked about all of that and hopefully given you a few options, and note there are like a bunch more translations that I haven't read and haven't looked at. Now, what if you wanted to bring Beowulf into another sort of format? Like, for example, if you wanted to play Beowulf in Pathfinder 2e, like the focus of a lot of my other videos. Well, I actually created this video in combination with Time to Dice, a Pathfinder build video creator. And now just click the link below to get directed straight to his video. Thank you for watching.